Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to New Worlds November. This is a new BookTube event that was the brainchild of Scott and Becky at the Bookish Bryants, and they gathered in a large crowd of great co-hosts to celebrate science fiction in the month of November. And to narrow that field down, we're celebrating science fiction short stories for this first Bookish Bryants New Worlds November. And to narrow that down even further, we have specific science fiction-y prompts for each week. No need to watch them if you don't want to. You just want to read some science fiction short works, anything fewer than 200 pages, then you have participated in New Worlds November. But if you want to follow the prompts, the prompt for this week is time travel. And it's a little bit barren. It's a little bit barren of a prompt for me, even though, one of the founding novels of science fiction, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, deals with that subject, and there have been no shortage of time travel stories since then. It's never really done it for me. I always thought it was a little too easy, even though, as I mentioned yesterday, I love all the time travel episodes of Star Trek. I always thought the time travel stories were a little too easy, that their conception of the past was a little odd. And the more, as I mentioned yesterday, the more that I learn even on a layman's level about subatomic particles or even general relativity, the more I start to think that it's not possible to do, that this is going to be another thing that turns out to be ungrounded in science, much like fantastic alien civilizations under the clouds of Venus. Once that was a booming science fiction subgenre, cottage genre of science fiction, and Edgar Rice Burroughs got how many novels out of that? Once humans learned for sure that there is nothing alive on the surface of Venus, there aren't tropical jungles, there aren't lost civilizations of any kind. There might once have been. I've read in science fiction magazines and online convincing simulations that say that Venus might have been a blue-skied, blue-water planet for a billion years. It's a long time. Life could develop in that time. But not anymore. There's no way that anything that we know as life could live on the surface of Venus. And we learned the same thing about Mars. And that's kind of pitiless. There's no way around that. So if you're a science fiction author, suddenly you can't be doing that. Suddenly you will be disloyal to one of the founding tenets of science fiction, which is that it respects science. Suddenly you can no longer pitch a story to a science fiction journal editor who might publish your story in which a spaceship crashes on Mars and finds tall gleaming spires and bald aliens. You can't do that anymore. The very first thing the editor would do, if they wrote back at all, would be to say, why don't you study up a little on the various probes that have landed on Mars. I think that real world science might be in the baby steps of coming to that same realization about time travel. I think that might be true, in which case that would certainly explain why I've been narrowing the field even further for New Worlds November by rereading, going back into Analog, Asimov, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction for the year 2021, and rereading. I subscribe to those issues and I read them front to back every other month. But I've been going back and revisiting those issues from this year, specifically looking for these prompts. It's been a lot of fun. I've been amazed at how few of those issues contain anything that resembles a time travel story. I would argue that also some other science fiction classic ideas are going out of fashion, slowly going out of fashion, one of which is the standby of science fiction, aliens. But certainly aliens in this solar system has gone right out the window. And as a remedy for that, just for today, I don't know that I'll keep doing this. As a remedy for today, I decided that apropos of the time travel prompt, I would do a little time traveling myself. So I went to Asimov's magazine from 1978, when it was called Isaac Asimov's magazine. I believe that this was just a few issues after the magazine started. Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, bit of a mouthful as a title, started off as a quarterly thing. And Asimov told his readers, and so did his editors, told the readers, well, it's up to you. If you want more of this, we certainly have the submissions. We'll give you more of it, but the sales have to justify it. I don't know if this is from July, August 1978, so I don't know if they'd gone bi-monthly by this point. I don't think it was long after this that they did. And it's a square-bound issue. It's a little bit smaller and a little bit skinnier than the current make of Asimov's. But I figured the further back in time I go in Asimov's or Analog, the more likely I am to find a time travel story. And I was right. There's a time travel story in this issue. There's also great ads for the latest science fiction novels. There's one, Home from the Shore by Gordon Dixon. A Gordon Dixon novel that is not a Dorsey novel that I like very much. And Charles Brown was the guy who did the books section, the section where he notes and talks about new books that have come to the office, that sort of thing. And in this issue from 1978, the lineup for his column at the beginning of this issue is as follows. Lucifer's Hammer by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. The White Dragon by Anne McCaffrey. The Well of Shuyan by C.J. Chera. The Faded Sun, Kesrith by C.J. Chera. The 1978 annual World's Best Science Fiction edited by Donald Walheim. The Earth Book of Stormgate by Paul Anderson. Swords and Devilry, Swords Against Death, Swords Against Wizardry, Swords in the Mist, Swords of Lankmar, Swords and Ice Magic, all by Fritz Leiber. Dahlgren by Samuel Delany. Nova and Empire Star and the Ballad of Beta 2 by Samuel Delany. To put it mildly, the books notices in the current issue of Asimov don't read like that. But Brown mostly just notes what books he got. That was used to be a standard practice in journals, where they would just note what they got, but not necessarily review it or talk about it. And in this issue, in the back of the issues, is page after page after page of letters. Here, it's not just one page; it's page after page of letters. And they got one letter here from a guy in Kenmore, New York, who writes, "I'd be interested in writing for Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. Please send me a description of your guidelines for writers. As an SF book reviewer for the last 4 years in a local magazine, I can say that I am glad Charles Brown merely lists the new titles with a succinct summary of each new book and refrains from making tedious and dogmatic value judgments. I don't trust book reviewers who play the pompous judge. I'd rather just be informed of what's new and make my own decisions on the bookstand." Which means that the writer from Kenmore, New York, who's been writing reviews of science fiction in a magazine for the last 4 years, is a very bad reviewer. At least we know that ahead of time. At least he told that to the editors. And the editors just respond. Asimov responds to half these letters himself. But the story... Oh, I just took my bookmark out. Oh, that's not good. Here, let's get back to it. I have to just find... yeah, there we go. All right, 156. The story is called One Rejection Too Many. And it is a little bit clever in its format. It's by Patricia Nurse. I've never heard of Patricia Nurse. No idea that Patricia Nurse was a real person. Could easily be Isaac Asimov. And if you tell me that she is a real person and has a long and storied history in science fiction, probably is won a shelf full of awards, and I've never heard of her, fine. But the name sounds familiar to me. It sounds a little fishy. But the story is One Rejection Too Many, and it's in the form of letters. The whole thing is in letters. Where Nancy Morrison writes letters to Dr. Asimov. She writes letters to Isaac Asimov, pitching a story for Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. So she pitches a story for this new science fiction magazine. I read in your second issue with interest your plea for stories from new authors. While no writer myself, I have had a time traveler living with me for the past 2 weeks. He materialized in the bathtub without clothes or money, so I felt obliged to offer him shelter. And he has written a story of life on Earth as it will be in the year 5000. Before he leaves this time frame, it would give him great pleasure to see his story in print. I hope you will feel able to make this wish come true. And Isaac Asimov responds, "Dear Miss Morrison, thank you for your kind letter and good wishes. It is always refreshing to hear from a new author. You have included some most imaginative material in your story. However, it is a little short on plot and human interest. Perhaps you could rewrite it with this thought in mind." And Miss Morrison writes back right away, "I was sorry to hear you weren't able to print the story I sent you. Val," the time traveler who wrote it, "was quite hurt. As he tells me, he is the author of some note in his own time. He has, however, rewritten the story, and this time he has included plenty of plot and some rather interesting mating rituals, which he has borrowed from the year 3000. In his own time, the year 5015, sex is no longer practiced, so you can see that it is perfectly respectable having him in my house. I do wish, though, that he could adapt himself to our custom of wearing clothes. My neighbors are starting to talk." And that Isaac Asimov is still not satisfied. He writes back to her, "Thank you for your rewritten short story. I don't want to discourage you, but I'm afraid you followed my suggestions with a little too much enthusiasm. However, I can understand that having an imaginary nude visitor from another time is a rather heady experience. I'm afraid that your story now resembles a far future episode of Mary Hartman, or Soap." You'll have to Google those, you younger people. "Could you tone it down a bit and omit the more bizarre sex rituals from the year 3000? We must remember that Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine is intended as a family publication." Now, Miss Morrison gets this. She's getting more irate as the letter changes go on, because she's saying that Val, her naked time traveler, is incensed that a mere peon from the 20th century would be rejecting his story. He gets more and more angry. She tries her best to work with him to improve the story. Finally, at the end of the exchange of letters, she writes a letter to Isaac Asimov saying that Val has, in a rage, left. He has left her own time and gone back to his time, she presumes. She's not really sure where he's gone. And the response that she gets from that letter is, "Dear Miss Morrison, I am very confused by your letter. Who is Isaac Asimov? I have checked with several publishers and none of them has heard of Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, although the address on the envelope was correct for this magazine. However, I was very impressed with your story and will be pleased to accept it for our next issue. Seldom do we receive a story combining such virtues, as well as a well-conceived plot, plenty of human interest, and a delightfully subtle brand of humor. Yours truly, George Sithers, editor, Arthur C. Clarke's Science Fiction Magazine." You were supposed to read that and think that Val has changed time. He's had the ultimate freelancer's revenge by wiping Isaac Asimov out of the timeline completely. I thought it was kind of clever for them to run that in Asimov's own magazine. And the point that I want to make about it, it's a totally throwaway thing. It's a gag. It's a gimmick. And the point that I want to make about it is that seems to me to be pretty much the sum and essence of what you can do with a time travel story. You can make it a gag. You can make it a gimmick of some kind. Oh boy, better not change this little detail. That sort of thing. Like Bradbury's The Sound of Thunder. Or Michael Crichton, his book Timeline, has a fantastic opening gimmick. I'm sure it was the thing that prompted the whole book. What would happen if an archaeological team working on a centuries-old castle in France uncovered a layer, very gently, carefully whisking away the gravel, uncovered a layer, an archaeological layer from those centuries ago, featuring 20th century spectacles that someone had dropped there and that had been buried and had sediment fold over it for centuries. What would that mean? That was a fantastic opening to that story, but the story makes precious little sense. Precious little sense. I would argue, to give credit where it's due, I would argue that Timeline by Michael Crichton is probably the most convincing time travel story that I've ever read. Even in terms of the mechanics of how the time travel is done. But when I have liked a science fiction short story, it has always been along the lines of that kind of a gimmick. Step on a butterfly's back and suddenly, that sort of thing. So I thought I'd share that, and I will continue, I think, to time travel throughout this week, rather than put 2021's examples of these magazines on the rack and trying to find time travel. I think I'll just roam around in the past of these magazines and see what else I can find. It's bound to be of interest. So I'll do that for the next few installments of this, and as the week goes on for this prompt. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.